Hello, everyone. Thank you for waiting. I guess we'll wait one more minute, then we'll start. I'll wait for a few more people to join. Okay, we'll start now. Alright, welcome to the second Nalanda Guides webinar. I'm Harshal Garg, the founder of Nalanda Guides, and today we'll be talking about the first major topic in Unit 3 of the APUSH curriculum, the causes of the American Revolution. So we'll talk about the French and Indian War, and then the events after the war leading up to the American Revolution. So basically, before the French and Indian War, the colonists were very divided among themselves. Many of them believed to be closer to Britain than among themselves. During the reign of Kings George I and George II, which was at about this time, Parliament had more power, and the colonial assemblies, which were the local legislative assemblies in the colonies, tried to assert their own dominance over Parliament and pass their laws. There wasn't significant conflict yet between the colonies and Britain, but the colonial assemblies were starting to gain power. Benjamin Franklin wanted to unite the colonies, so in 1754 he proposed the Albany Plan, which is a plan to unite all of the colonies, except for Georgia, under one government, which would be still subordinate to the British Crown. No one approved this, but this set a precedent for the future union of the colonies after the American Revolution. Meanwhile, in the late 1600s, France was expanding in the Americas. Quebec was founded in 1608, and French merchants sailed down the Mississippi River to Louisiana, establishing the port of New Orleans. Quebec, which is now present-day Quebec City, was fortified, and the fortress of Louisbourg was guarding the entrance of the St. Lawrence River. Unlike the English and the Spanish, the French had good relations with the Indians and traded fur with them. The French had alliances with most of the Indians in the area, unlike the English. Now, because both the English and the French were expanding into the U.S., they fought for power. The Iroquois Confederacy was a group of natives that did not side with the English nor the French and chose to remain neutral. The Iroquois later played a major role in the French and Indian War, as they are one of the most powerful Indian groups in the region. The English and French fought many wars against each other, including King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. While England and France signed a peace treaty after King George's War, France was angered when the neutral Iroquois natives, which are the most powerful tribe in the region, decided to side with the English. So because of that, the French built many fortresses in the Ohio Valley, a region encompassing present-day Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, West Virginia, and some other states in that region. And this is where most of the Iroquois lived. The French had alliances with the other tribes in the Ohio Valley, but the Iroquois were the largest tribe and allied with the English. So the English were angered that the French built fortresses in the Ohio Valley. So in 1754, George Washington, who will soon become the first president of the U.S., led a militia into the valley and built Fort Necessity. He tried to attack Fort Duquesne, located in present-day Pittsburgh, which was a French fort that the French built to protect against the English, but the French countered and trapped his entire army in Fort Necessity, killing a third of them, so Washington had to surrender. And this is regarded as the official start of the French and Indian War. The first phase lasted from 1754 to 1756 before the war spread to Europe, and in this time, Britain failed to provide enough aid to the colonists to attack the French, and English General Edward Braddock failed to defend Fort Necessity from the French. At this time, the French were winning the war. Now the second phase of the war comes from 1756 to 1758, when the war spread to England and Europe, and the English provided a lot of aid, but forced the colonists to provide aid as well, causing many riots among the colonists. This is when the war spread to England, because France and England took opposite sides in the 7 Years' War, which was a war between Austria and Prussia. So the English Secretary of State, William Pitt, took control of the British Army, forcing the colonists to provide for it. And this led to many riots. The colonists were forced to provide food, were forced to join the army, and even quarter soldiers, which led to many riots among the colonists. So many colonists hated this. And now the final phase is from 1758 to 1763, when William Pitt relaxed some of the laws for the colonists, compensating them for all their losses. In this phase, the war started to take a turn because the French suffered a bad harvest in 1756, so the English generals Amherst and Wolfe took over Fort Louisbourg in 1758, and Wolfe took over Quebec in 1759, where he and the French general died. The French surrendered soon after. Now after the war, France ceded a lot of territory to Britain as outlined in the Peace of Paris. Britain got the French-Canadian territories, some West Indian lands, and some Indian territories. England won all of the land east of the Mississippi River, while Spain won the Louisiana Territory, which was west of the Mississippi River. Now that Britain had lots of territory, Britain viewed its colonies more for territorial purposes than for economic purposes. Britain now viewed its colonies as having a large population that it can tax, as opposed to having a large working population that can generate revenue. And due to all this extra land that Britain gained west of the original 13 colonies, many people disagreed on who should inhabit the 13 colonies, the land west of the 13 colonies. So some believe that 13 colonies should expand westward, others believe that new colonies should be made, and others believe that the land should be left to the Indians because westward expansion would create conflict with the Indians. Thus, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, creating a treaty line between the English and Indian territory west of the 13 colonies to prevent colonial expansion west of that line, so that there are no conflicts with the Indians. This also allowed Parliament to gain more control over the colonies, as Parliament was able to control the westward expansion of the colonists. Now, after the war, there was also a slight economic depression, and there were also many internal rebellions within the colonies, because the poor people didn't want to pay the high taxes. The most notable rebellions are the Paxton Boys and the Regulator Movement. And now we move to the buildup of the American Revolution. So Britain resented the colonies for being militarily inept during the war, so Parliament tightened its controls over the colonies. Also, Britain had lots of debts from the French and Indian War, so Prime Minister George Grenville approved raising taxes on the colonies to pay off the war debts, because the British people did not want to be taxed. So Grenville passed the Mutiny Act, which put soldiers in the colonies and also in the Atlantic ports to prevent smuggling from the non-British lands, to enforce the Navigation Acts. And he also passed the Sugar Act, which raised taxes on sugar to prevent illegally importing sugar from the Spanish or the French West Indies, to allow for the growth of the English sugar industry. Now we come to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was the worst of all the acts. It placed a tax on stamps, which were required for all written documents, and it was the most hated tax because it nearly affected everyone, because almost everyone had some sort of written document. Thus, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed the Virginia Resolves, a series of resolutions to remove Parliament's power to tax the colonies, and this failed. Similarly, James Otis of Massachusetts created the Stamp Act Congress with delegates from 9 colonies to try to repeal the act, but Parliament rejected it. Now, the most effective sort of resistance is the boycott. The colonists decided to boycott all the British goods to protest the Stamp Act, so the new Prime Minister, Rockingham, repealed the Stamp Act. But Parliament hated this because they thought that the colonists could similarly protest all the acts and have all the taxes on them repealed. So under pressure from Parliament, Rockingham passed the Declaratory Act, stating that from now on, Parliament has complete authority over the colonies. The English king dismissed Rockingham from office because the English people protested that decreasing the taxes on the colonies would increase taxes on them, so the English king dismissed Rockingham. So William Pitt, who was the military general during the French and Indian War, became the prime minister. But since he was really old and he wasn't able to work, his chancellor, Charles Townshend, did most of the work. So basically, Charles Townshend passed the Quartering Act, which was an amendment to the Mutiny Act, which forced the colonists to provide shelter to the British soldiers which were dispatched in the colonies. He also passed the Townshend Acts, taxing all the goods imported from Britain. The colonists responded angrily to the Townshend Acts, so the Massachusetts Legislative Assembly circulated a letter called the Circular to each colony, and eventually all of the colonies supported Massachusetts in opposing the Townshend Acts, and this brought more unity among the colonies, as they all protested against the British Acts. In 1768, many merchants organized a boycott of British goods to protest the tax. So in 1770, after Townshend died, the new Prime Minister, Lord North, repealed all of the taxes except for the tax on tea. Now, because the Boston colonists were harassing customs officials for collecting taxes, Britain put 4 regiments of its army in Boston. The colonists hated the presence of the soldiers, and what the colonists hated more was that these soldiers, during their off hours, during the times they weren't working, were applying for jobs at local businesses, competing with the local colonists for these jobs. Once, in March 1770, a group of soldiers went to a shipyard to apply for a job. But some colonists who were working there got mad that the soldiers were applying for a job, which led to a brief skirmish between them. A few days later, some colonists were throwing rocks and snowballs at the customs house in Boston, so the British regiment lined in front to protect it. But then one of the colonists knocked down one of the soldiers, so another soldier fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists, and this event is known as the Boston Massacre. In 1772, some colonists from Rhode Island boarded a British ship called the Gatsby and started to fire. This is known as the Gatsby Incident. Now in 1773, the British East India Company was about to collapse, so Britain issued the Tea Act, exempting the British East India Company from the tax on tea. Now if you remember from the Townshend Acts, the Townshend Acts placed a tax on all British goods, including tea, but then in 1770 when they were repealed except for the tax on tea. So this Tea Act in 1773 exempt the British East India Company from the Tea Act because it was to guarantee its prosperity, to allow for it to be prosperous again, and to prevent them from going bankrupt. The Parliament passed the Tea Act to exempt it from the tax on tea. And this actually angered the colonists because they believed it to be another unjust tax. And they also believed that this would allow the British East India Company to undersell them, hurting the colonial tea economy. So basically, the colonists decided to boycott the British tea, and women played a major role in this because they were the main consumers of tea. So later, a group of men dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships full of tea cargo and dumped all of the tea into the Boston Harbor, an incident known as the Boston Tea Party. Now after the Boston Tea Party, King George III and Prime Minister Lord North passed the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. These tightened control over the colonies, limiting the self-government of the colonies, closing the Boston Harbor, and forcing the quartering of British soldiers in all empty buildings and even barns. They later passed the Quebec Act, making all French-speaking lands in Canada and the Ohio Valley part of a region called Quebec, where they imposed Catholicism. The colonists were angered by both of these laws, especially the Quebec Act, because they feared that imposing Catholicism in Quebec would set a precedent, and later on they feared that the British would impose Anglicanism in the colonies. And the colonists hated this because many of them weren't Anglican. Most of them, especially New England, were Puritan and hated and went to the colonies in exile from Anglicanism. And all of these events come to the start of the American Revolution, the War of Independence. So the colonists basically believed that their government should not be corrupt and should have some checks and balances where each branch of the government can check the power of the other. Britain had a checks and balances system between the monarchy, aristocracy, and commoners, but the monarchy wielded such great power that no one could really check them. So because of this, the colonists wanted a balanced and a non-corrupt government. Furthermore, the colonists wanted each region of the government to have representation. They believed that each region of the British Empire should have representation in the British Parliament. So for this reason, they rallied under the cry, "No taxation without representation," because they believed that they were under the jurisdiction of Parliament but did not have any representation in Parliament, which is unjust. So many people organized their own autonomous councils, most notably the Committees of Correspondence, which sought to resist British rule. The first Committee of Correspondence was founded by Samuel Adams in Massachusetts, who was a cousin of John Adams, who would later become the second president of the U.S., but an Intercolonial Committee of Correspondence was created later in Virginia. Now the most important one is in 1774, delegates from 12 colonies, all the 13 colonies except for Georgia, met at Philadelphia as the first Continental Congress, a committee that sought to get independence from Britain. They made a list of grievances to Britain and also agreed to make military preparations in case of war with Britain. They also agreed to meet the next spring, which will later be known as the Second Continental Congress. And now we come to the official start of the American Revolution, which is the battles of Lexington and Concord. As part of the agreement in the First Continental Congress, the local farmers in Massachusetts were collecting arms and munitions in case of war with Britain. General Thomas Gage of Britain was dispatched in Lexington, a city near Boston, when he heard about a gunpowder storehouse made by these Massachusetts farmers, which was located in Concord, 18 miles from Lexington. So he ordered 1,000 of his British soldiers to travel to Concord to take over the storehouse, but 2 colonists overheard him. So those colonists went on horse in the night to warn the local farmers. So the next day, when the British soldiers arrived, the farmers were waiting outside to defend, but the soldiers fired into the farmers, killing many of them. However, on their way back to Lexington, some of the farmers were hiding behind the trees, and they fired into the British soldiers, killing 3 times as many. And this incident is regarded as the official start of the Revolutionary War. Now I'll just give a brief summary of my lecture, then we'll move on to questions. So basically at the beginning, England and France both sought to expand into the Americas, and the most powerful Indian tribe, the Iroquois, remained neutral. When the Iroquois decided to side with the English, the French got mad and built forts in the area, so the English attacked them, which is the start of the French and Indian War. This war gave Britain more control over the 13 colonies by forcing some colonists to provide support to or join the military, and eventually the English won, giving Britain more land. Eventually, Britain had lots of debts from the war, so it increased its control over the colonies and started taxing them, causing the colonists to resent the British rule. The colonists organized councils to discuss strategies to evade British rule, most notably the First Continental Congress, and they discussed that people should make military preparations in case war with Britain would happen. Thus, created a storehouse with gunpowder, which the British sought to take over, creating a small battle between the colonists and the British, which is regarded the first battle in the American Revolution. Now that my lecture is over, I'll open up to any questions you may have. Please type your questions in the chat. Where did the Minutemen get their supplies from? They probably got it from the local industries in the colonies, because if you probably know, the colonies had some munitions, some arms, and some shipbuilding industries. Any other questions? What do you mean, what was the main economic pressure on the colonies? And the Boston Tea Party is probably called a party because from the colonial perspective, it was a party in that it was fun for them. as they were resenting British rule. So basically, the biggest economic impact that started the revolution was that I'm pretty sure that the taxes that the British were imposing was actually hurting the colonial economy, because putting taxes on all like commodities, all English commodities like tea, grain, like things like that, was hurting the local industries, especially the Tea Act, because it was hurting the local tea industry, as the British East India Company was exempt from taxes, so it was able to dominate the tea industry. And also, the British put restrictions on the colonial shipbuilding industries and manufacturing industries. So for that reason, because the economy was falling due to the strict control of Parliament, the colonists sought to rebel. Any other questions? Can I compare and contrast the religion in the different colonies? So basically, New England was largely Puritan, and in the South you get more like Anglican and kind of Catholic societies. Wouldn't Parliament be incentivized to grow the colonial industry? So actually, during this time, after the French and Indian War, Parliament viewed the colonies more for territorial purposes than for economic purposes. Like, they didn't care much about the revenue of the colonies. They just wanted to tax them. They just wanted to control more people so it could tax them. And they thought that they could probably earn more money and more glory if they were to tax the people than not tax them and just let them have their own economy. And one example of this is that many territorialists, basically after the French and Indian War, many territorialists wanted France to cede Canada to England, but other people that cared about the economy wanted France to cede Guadeloupe, which is a sugar-rich country, a sugar-rich island in the West Indies, to England. Are there any other questions? Are there any other questions relating to the topic? Yes, the Battle of Lexington was Paul Revere's famous ride. Paul Revere rode in the middle of the night to warn the local farmers, and that's the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It was Paul Revere and William Dawes that rode to Concord to warn the locals. Any other questions? Are there any other questions? If not, I'll end the webinar. So the main acts that were passed by the British were first the Mutiny Act, then the Sugar Act. So the Mutiny Act put soldiers in the colonies. The Sugar Act put a tax on sugar to prevent the colonists from importing sugar from non-British lands. The Currency Act prevented the colonists from having paper money. Then the Stamp Act put a tax on all stamps. The Townshend Acts put a tax on all goods imported from Britain. The Quartering Act, which was an amendment to the Mutiny Act, forced the colonists to provide shelter to British troops. And then you have the Declaratory Act, which stated that Britain had complete control over the colonies. Then you have the Intolerable Act, also known as Coercive Acts, which tightened control over the colonies. And you have the Quebec Act, which made all the French-speaking lands part of a region called Quebec, which was Catholic. Any other questions? Are there other questions? So the Olive Branch Treaty comes in the Second Continental Congress, which will be covered in the next webinar. Are there any other questions? If not, I'll end the webinar. Alright, thank you for joining the webinar. I'll end it now.